This week, both Facebook and YouTube gave hate monger Alex Jones a 30-day timeout. But what if it hardly matters?
We'll look at the growing dominance of right-wing conservative voices in web media.
What if the deck is stacked and social media has already been weaponized?
This week on Future Forward, the future of democracy. I'm Gene DeRose.
And I'm Steve Rosenbaum, and this is Future Forward, and let's launch. So Gene, that was an upbeat, positive intro, right? I mean, people are going, "Oh, I'm not listening to that, Jesus." But
right.
No, but we're going to dig in and promise people some real hopeful outcomes with some slightly grim undertones. So don't leave us just yet. Promising solutions at the end of the half hour. But meanwhile, your trademark loving and hating. I know that there's real love this week. So let's start with the love, shall we?
Yeah. Well, since our theme is media in the context of the future of democracy, I'm trying to stay theme consistent. So what I'm loving this week in the context of all that is something called Now This News, or Now This, as the company was originally named. It came out of a combination of New York players, Lara Hippo, and I believe BetaWorks was involved, and some others. And a few years ago, it got acquired or folded into a new company called Group 9 Media, which has Thrillist and
the Dodo. Yeah.
Theoretically, a new kind of liberal tacking media company. But now let's just focus on what the product is. It has blisteringly short but entertaining and informative 15 to 20 second, 15-ish quick blasts on news. And they use a lot of big, bold graphics, words on the screen to help tell the stories, so they fit in a mode where you can see them on Facebook when the sound's turned down, and you can see them over the transom. They're perfect for Instagram. They have had a decent life in other places like Snapchat. And I think it underscores an interesting new way to try to tell some stories. And in light of the dangers of this week, where we worry that conservative voices have some inherent advantages, here's some evidence that, if not liberal, then straightforward, uninflected journalism does have a prayer in this world if it makes itself entertaining. Do you like Now This?
I do. I do. I'm glad they're there. I don't think they solve the news problem, but I think that they're part of a solution for sure. And by the way, I think the buyer of the Group 9 Media, I think, was actually Discovery Networks. Was the big
they were $100 million worth of contributing into it. So I believe they are the majority owner of
Group 9,
which is still, I think, private.
All right. So
we will get back to that in a second.
Yes, we will. All right.
So let's move to hating, and I think we're going to get back to this side of it too. And just to be clear, I can be hating something that I don't hate permanently. This week I'm hating CNN, and the reason I'm hating CNN really is because of how my ears have burned as I brooded over this topic. And, they're in a very tough spot, but I don't think they do a particularly good job at managing the middle or being the other side of Fox. If you look at television news, in a way, they're really in the middle between MSNBC and Fox, and yet they're really perceived, because of their size, to be the counter to Fox. And, it kind of sucks, because in this day and age, one of our arguments here is that plain old journalism that's straightforward and objective is now what's termed fake news or liberal journalism. But I do think that CNN does two things that are contradictory and problematic. One is, I don't think they show enough courage and boldness in actually breaking news and doing more than just have a lot of talking heads around things that are canned, White House reports. That's not somebody reporting news. That's somebody who's just listening to the press conference. And the second thing is they allow false equivalency in a way that they really should have been harder headed about. A lot of people think they had a lot to do with getting Trump elected because, they were allowed to be a second voice in opposition to a conservative voice on opinionated segments and all the talk stuff of theirs. And a lot of those people's comments should be held to a higher standard. And it's the same thing that happens in debates these days. But we'll be getting into this over time. But CNN, you can do better.
So I'm gonna defend CNN on this before we get into the larger show, because many years ago a friend of mine who was a senior executive at CNN called me, early days of Fox, and he said, I have this problem. My boss is judging our performance based on how our ratings look compared to Fox. And he said, what should I do? And I remember saying at the time, write a resignation letter. Because
Yes.
it would be like you saying to your kids, all right, kids, you have two choices for dinner: ice cream or broccoli.
Right.
And by the way, I like broccoli.
Yeah.
But if you give me a choice between ice cream and broccoli, I'm going to have ice cream all day long. And I think that the false equivalency is that the whole media space has been drawn into this really muddy, and this is what we're going to talk about, this really muddy place where everything that calls itself news is news. And, the reality is, if you make shit up and you don't tell the truth and you're not telling the truth, you're not making up news. I like Oprah's show fine, but Oprah doesn't pretend that she's a newscaster.
Yep.
So to me, talk shows, entertainment, discussion, debate, all that stuff is one thing, and news is another. So the show we're going to do today is, let me start with a little bit of a preface for the audience. I've been researching for the last couple of weeks the disconnect between the numbers on so-called progressive, left, objective, mainstream, call it whatever you will, media, and hardcore right extremist stuff. And as I dug into it, there's some data and a lot of anecdotal information that says it's about 5 to 1.
Yeah.
And that's really disturbing. And maybe even let's just start with the Facebook and YouTube decision to give Alex Jones a 30-day timeout. And by the way, I called it timeout with a appropriate, that's really what it is. It's a slap on the hand.
It's a slap.
And by the way, if you look at the actual impact on Alex Jones's audience, it's negligible, because while he's not allowed to publish under his own name, all the channels that he owns are still publishing, and they can publish him. So all it really means, it would be like if you have a website saying, well, that admin is getting a 30-day timeout, but you can still publish all the same stuff and use all the same voices. So I'm not sure that YouTube's timeout is any different, although it would be fun to look back in 30 days, make a note in our calendar, and see if there were any meaningful changes in the audience. My guess is that you're going to find not.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two parts of that too that, no one's figured out, much less those that are doing the wrist slapping or trying to set standards. Is, there seems to be like these kind of two, not the same thing, but overlapping things that are problematic. One is the relative truth or falseness, and everything having to do with the sourcing and the credibility and how the white lie becomes a game of telephone, right? So the essence of truth in journalism and what should be done. And the second is, the nature of the dialogue, things like hate speech and abusive behaviors and things like that. And I think these are, and that's not all there is to it, but those are the two radioactive categories. And it's a lot easier to manage abusive behaviors online than it is to go at this giant sinkhole of deciding to say what is closer to truth or not. And this is really going to be a problem.
So let's talk about this Mother Jones article.
Great article, by the way.
Yeah, and so you'll see in the comments we'll post the clip. There was a Mother Jones article, I have to say, about a website and a network that I had never heard of. I guess somewhere in the back of my head I'd heard of Dennis Prager. He'd been around for a while.
You would recognize him from occasionally showing up as a pundit, but you wouldn't know that he was doing this and had become such a media player.
And when you read it, the thing that's chilling about it is, it is absolutely and non-negotiably a strategy. It's not a bunch of kids in their dorm room messing around with video cameras. It's, so maybe let's just talk a little bit about what was the thing that you found most surprising about Prager University?
I guess what I found most surprising is how much I admired the sophistication of the storytelling and faux documentary approach that they were bringing to this. Now this news is a really interesting sidelight. I've talked about something in the past that is a children's animated series called Brain Pop, and it really reminded me of that in a way. If you take something and make it really entertaining and really fun, but really focus on content, information, and teaching people things for the right audience, you can entertain them and teach them. Now, that doesn't have anything to do to say with whether you're being truthful or not. The great thing about Brain Pop is it takes curriculum-based truths and instills them. But the problem is you can use this kind of faux. They're almost, what they're almost like, Steve? They're almost like all these explainer videos. They've taken that kind of model, almost made it, it's a mashup between that, a BuzzFeed video, and a documentary short. And they are, the fact that they are persuading what are largely, let's narrow it down, younger white males is a scary thing, but it doesn't end there.
Yeah, no, and I was trying to think of the name. It slipped my mind of the network, the former conservative radio host. What? No. Who did the chalkboard he did the whole chalkboard thing?
He used to be on Fox and now has his own network.
Well, although then he flipped him and said he was anti-Trump, and then our friend Bob Garfield chewed on him on the radio. It's terrible. I can't remember his name.
Old.
And but this is, it seems to me like Prager is a better version of him. And if you read deep into the article, Prager doesn't even own the thing. He's kind of a paid face of it.
No, and it's called Prager University. It's got a very, read the article. We're giving you a little bit of a sketchy outline, but part of what is happening here that let's not glide over, even though it's in one of our syllabus pieces that you'll see the links to, is this idea that it isn't just Fox News where persuasion is happening in the conservative world. Under the nose of the liberal media or journalism itself, YouTube in many ways has become an epicenter of powerful conservative persuasion, and other places that would surprise people.
And the problem is, YouTube prides itself in free speech and blah 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 and all of that good stuff. So in a weird kind of way, they're boxed in, and I would say Facebook is to some extent as well, which is if they start trying to create any parameters around where the line is between reasonable speech and, as we'll get to in a minute, hate speech or some of this more dangerous stuff, like they just get slammed for being censors, being the police, being the thought police.
That's right. That's right. And let's look. This is a little zigzaggy because it's a topic we're going to get to, but it's relevant here, which is that surprising some people, it's turning out that Facebook's conservative stories are doing, really, when a conservative stories is on Facebook, it does considerably better than the liberal or the unbiased ones. And I think what I'd like to sort of step back for a second and mention, which you and I talked about offline a second ago, is that, and this has been talked about for over a decade, and it's one of the reasons that people pointed to Fox, is that Fox News' rise, which is that the fundamentals of persuasion lie very much when it comes to entertainment in the favor of the conservative, or at least the very extreme Tea Party version of emotional resentment-powered conservative dialogue. And that's because this is emotional rather than intellectual storytelling. This is feelings. This is, me versus you. This is something that is very compelling. And let's face it, YouTube and Facebook, this is about advertising dollars. They make their money based on, who watches things and is persuaded the most. And so there's a fundamental problem with, journalism, is that it sometimes fails to be as entertaining as it can be. And that's a hard thing.
Yeah. All right. We'll try and stay on course.
Yeah. I just wanted to get the bigger point.
So now let's get to this. So a year ago, a little more than a year ago, Vice wrote this really thoughtful, turned out prescient piece about why the right is dominating YouTube. Author named Tom Wyman. And when you read it today, a year and a half later, it reads like a roadmap to the end of democracy as we know it. It's grim. It truly is, and nothing's changed. I mean, if anything, it seems like all the things that started to happen 18 months ago, or maybe it's longer than that, have all continued. And
that's right.
The argument that is made among experts that Wyman speaks to essentially is that weaponized right-wing anger suits itself to the social frame better than thoughtful, complex, democratic, kind of high-minded thinking.
Right, right. The cool, it's, some of it goes back to McLuhan, cool versus hot dialogue and content. And, even Obama, who was a cool legislator and figure of government, but was a hot campaigner. This is a very important distinction in why he did well as a campaigner. But, some people after many years, found that he didn't swing people on policy. This is something that we're kind of seeing the proof of over and over again. And I sometimes wonder why people are even surprised, because this is the kind of thing that, has now almost like a virus leapt out of the body of television into the digital world and is now kind of metastasizing online and in particular in places like YouTube. So we're hearing a lot of things about take this down, slap hands and stuff. It kind of reminds me of the original years of YouTube when pirated versions of Viacom and Time Inc. shows were getting kicked off or on. But now this is about, news and inappropriate content.
Yeah. I mean, we started talking about this last week a little bit. I mean, when you listen to Zuckerberg talk about, Holocaust deniers and in this very even, thoughtful, it's almost like he's trying to find an algorithm for truth.
Right.
And for those of us who've been in the news business a long time, that's just not how truth works. You sit at the editor's desk, something crosses your desk, you're on deadline, and you have to make a judgment about your readers, about the source, about the tone, about the imagery, and you have to make a decision that has all kinds of human, complexity that, like, I'm just not sure you're ever going to program into AI. And,
right. Yep. And in terms of the, these fundamental questions about the content that's being discussed, that persuasion swings one way or the other, I always feel like this is dangerous ground, because all the evidence points to education and higher education correlating to liberal and the other way around. So you get caught in this dumb versus smart stuff, and you don't want to go there. But it is true that there is a wonkiness to dicing up many liberal issues and the dialogue around them into many, many, many arguments versus 5 or 7 very simple emotions and points of view that dominate and drive, politics, but are on the side of the conservatives, right? I mean, there's not some, it's remarkable how just in the last 2 weeks we've seen the full flowering of conservative philosophy doesn't even matter anymore. It's just about us versus them. And if Trump decides, voters are just going to be with him regardless. Doesn't matter if suddenly he's for Russians instead of against the Soviet Union, which used to be like, the badge that conservatives wore was to be, anti-communist. So these are very hard things to know what there are going to be answers other than educating everyone and relying on people being informed and educated, which you can't.
So here's the thing I don't understand, just to be blunt.
Yep.
The phrase crooked Hillary. It's not particularly poetic. it's not particularly romantic. Like there's nothing. It's not really good advertising. It's not like it's just that he delivered it so relentlessly and with vitriol. Like Crooked Donald has no less or more poetry than Crooked Hillary, except that Crooked Donald bankrupted 4 companies and got sued 10 gabillion times. So in terms of like the actual accuracy, like Crooked Donald has a whole lot more legitimacy as a moniker than Crooked Hillary, and yet like to watch the Attorney General chanting "lock her up" the other day.
Yep.
Yeah,
well, look, repetition matters. If you remember back in 2016, there was a period before Trump's nomination was a foregone conclusion, where a fair number of journalists and pundits decided they were not even going to mention his name or cover him, and that went away really fast, because what they knew was inherently the obsessiveness of coverage reinforces it. Just like saying Crooked Hillary over and over again eventually gets people to think, these are among some of the most frustrating things. Something that started at 8 or 10 years ago was they're all the same. There's no difference between the parties. Nothing could be further than the truth when you really came down to it. But lots of people, especially in the middle, that swing right or left every 4 years, say there's no difference. I just like who I like this year. And that's, if you care about certain policies, that's insanity.
So I'm going to do something that risks really angering our listeners. But as I was thinking about this Media Matters for America data that you talked about earlier, one of the things that they discovered is not just that right-wing content was outperforming left, but that memes were performing left. And I found myself thinking, maybe I blame Jon Stewart.
I keep going because I feel your track.
Because he said, "Oh, it's all comedy." He delivered something that clearly wasn't comedy, and whenever he got kind of painted into a corner or criticized, he said, "I'm just a comedian here." Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We all among his audience knew it wasn't comedy. We knew he was telling truth to power, and we appreciated that. But there was something about wrapping it in a comedic wrapper that made it at 11 o'clock at night a little more palatable and shareable and less grim. But like the weaponization of comedy has now been turned into this unbelievably, there was this thing the other day where they took the Ortega interview and they crafted it and faked it and added audio and made her say things she didn't say. And then when they got caught at it, they said, "Oh, well, it's just satire. Oh, we forgot to label it satire, but it's satire." Like somehow comedy is this now get out of jail free card.
I think you're hitting on something really powerful, and I actually think this belongs back in the original dialogue and the point about Prager University. Entertain, in a way, you could argue that the success of Prager was a direct, if they're as smart as they sometimes seem they might be, albeit evil, you would think this was an attempt to try to reach younger people in the way Jon Stewart has successfully reached younger people who are not going to take dry news but are going to be informed and persuaded through entertainment. I agree with you about comedy, and comedy itself has a special power, but I also think it's a subset of, entertainment, wins no matter what, and comedy in particular is a high form. Now, I think there's another point that you may or may not be referencing, which is that the politics of persuasion are salt on the wounded by comedy in a way, because you are ridiculing the other side and you're humiliating them and you're making them look bad and stupid. And there's no doubt about it that the rise of Jon Stewart, burns people. There were people, I remember back when Jon Stewart started and it was less obvious how polemical things were, I could watch it with my conservative friends. Over time, it became something that's like, that's over there and this is over here. But I think your point is great. Yeah. And I know we don't want to get lost because Jon Stewart wasn't even a topic today, but
so now let's get to kind of where things are going. We promised ourselves that we'd spend the last 5 minutes on the future of media, because there are some things on the horizon, some of the worth talking about. When you think about kind of where this all takes us, like what is there data that says that we're going to turn a corner? Like we're like looking at that, the visual capitalist future of media and entertainment chart that we pulled up. Like,
yep.
I saw some promising trends in there.
Well, tell me what you think, because I would say there's intriguing points in there, but I don't see the inflection or indicators of good or bad news in there, except the movement towards digital over broadcast and traditional forms. And the biggest thing that I saw that worried me a little bit in there, before you come with the good stuff, is the, of course, we're not surprised, continued decline of newspapers. And here's something that I just want to reference into all this, which is, even as we sit here today, most of the original reporting that's done in the world, and certainly in the U.S., is done by newspaper reporters, the original reporting. And it's amazing how that's becoming this inverse. I mean, let's stay with where we are. There's a final story that we're going to get to that's going to be a coda to this, but I do feel like that's a big issue. And so where do you see some cracks in the firmament here?
So for me, I think it comes down to dollars.
Yes.
And I think as long as advertisers are fundamentally paying for audience at scale, they are driving the media to do things that are more extreme. They're rewarding Facebook, they're rewarding YouTube for traffic, and to me, we've seen little tests where people got frustrated and they said, "Wait a minute, the anti-gun movement, went to a bunch of big retailers and said, we're not shopping with you, we're not patronizing you until you take guns out of your stores." And I think Dick's Sporting Goods and a number of others said, "You know what? It's just not worth it. We're out." And so to me, it's about finding a mechanism to have people vote with their wallet and say, we're not looking for ads on, if you're buying ads on extreme content, then we're not your customer.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point, and I think that points to one of the two pieces of this. One is how activism of the audience can take a form in terms of outcries, and we're going to refuse to buy this and that. The second is, remember the old story about how even as Fox News was rising, CNN for a long time had more revenues because their demographics were more attractive. So they could have like a third less numbers, and yet they were getting the 18 to 34, 18 to 49 market. I actually heard in something you just said something promising in that respect, which is really interesting. And here's a player we haven't mentioned that's kind of been on the rise lately, which is MSNBC. Used to be thought of as the completely irrelevant far left here, but in the heels of Bernie Sanders' rise, democratic socialism rise, let's look at that as part of your answer there. And I'm not saying rooting for that side as much as to say the economics you speak of are such that demographic, if it keeps expanding for that kind of audience, is increasingly going to be a very rich advertiser pile, even relative to the bulk of Fox that still largely attracts 60 and above demographics.
Which brings us to civil and the future of blockchain. So a couple of things. First of all, our friend Vivian Schiller has taken the helm there, and
used to run NPR, used to do a few other things.
Was very important. New York Times, Discovery Times, really, and smart and wonderful, and a friend for a long time. And it's important for our listeners to not roll their eyes when they hear civil and blockchain and be like, "Oh, that's complicated." The idea that we could connect audiences and their economic power with good journalism is so fabulously cool. We should all get up every morning and be excited about that.
I actually like the way you said it, because you said it in such a simple way that the outcome is dead on. And without diving into the full complexity of blockchain, can we back up into the bigger picture to say how it is that happens? Is it that the micro not micro payments as much as the micro attention we have means, the problem today is that you're either like part of the New York Times or this or that, and somebody's either paying for all that in bulk, and there's nothing that really, rewards stuff that's good or smart or that we find special appeal to. Is it that we can direct, we can reward stuff that's we like or that's good or that's righteous, that is more realistic?
So think of it this way. The reason why we get so much spam in our mailbox and our email is because there's no cost to send it. And if you're not if they send you spam that's trying to sell you a stroller for your baby, and you're like, I don't have a baby, it doesn't cost them anything to waste your time and be wrong, right?
Right.
So maybe you're a little annoyed that Bye Bye Baby is sending you stroller ads, but there's no pushback. What Civil's trying to do is essentially make the process of publishing media and also challenging media cost tokens. So that if you want to be in a reasonable conversation about the veracity of a story or the inaccuracy of a story, you have to actually pony up some coins.
Right.
And I think you'd find that this runaway train of right-wing, hate-filled media would be dialed way down if every time they posted something like that, they had to pay for it. And I'd be I'd be delighted to push back on that. So
is that, which in and of itself I can understand, possibly something that might evolve in a direction that meets something that's coming from the other side, which is that, as you and I know, in places like Facebook and Google and Twitter, unlike the old days of giant media spends, you can surgically spend small amounts of money to push and cajole and find the sweet spot for your story or your note of persuasion. And it's kind of democratized, but also caused a lot of havoc there, right? I mean, if the idea is, you got to pay to distribute your stuff, that is kind of what we're doing when we push things through with advertising. I know it's not the same, but boy, it's you're speaking to individual journalists or journalistic, entities that should have a more rigorous path to getting exposure. I don't know how the best way to say that is.
Well, let's leave it at this because we're out of time. We didn't get here overnight. A whole bunch of decisions got made over a really long period of time, and people went, whatevs. We're not going to get this fixed overnight, but it's really important that everyone that cares about storytelling and accuracy in media and journalism pays attention to the fact that more noisy, shitty media pushed into the ecosystem is likely to take us to a really terrible place. And I'll say just this in closing. One of the things that has to happen in the next couple of months is that there is a fairly large number of people that I think of as disenfranchised Democrats.
Yes,
they've been cajoled, threatened, extorted into exhaustion, and they need to get back up and
right. And heading into this election cycle, which is a midterm, it's going to be really, really interesting. I want to just add one little note before we leave, because it's on topic, but because we cover media so regularly, I would argue we get to it next week, but I don't want the article to age too much. Steve wrote a really great article we were going to discuss in the context of something that's really important, which is the rise of and the staying power, curiously, of Roku. So we'll include that link, but I think it's something that we need to discuss, not for your article, but because it's an important issue next week or in the weeks after.
In the meantime, future forward, have an excellent week.
Yes, too.
See you next week.
Bye, Steve.